The sound of Mama's scream still echoes in my dreams even now at 83. It was a sound no child should ever hear, raw, desperate, filled with the kind of terror that comes when you know death is reaching for you with greedy fingers. I was 6 years old that February morning in 1948 when I found her collapsed on our kitchen floor, blood pooling beneath her like spilled wine, her eyes wide with a fear that had nothing to do with the baby she was losing and everything to do with what she knew was coming. "Rose, baby?" She gasped, her voice barely a whisper as her life drained away. "Your daddy's gonna try to save me, but they won't let him. They never let us." Her hand squeezed mine with desperate strength as footsteps pounded up our tenement stairs. "Remember this, child. Remember who kills us with their silence." My name is Catherine Rose Williams, though the world came to know me as Rose Thompson, civil rights activist, Atlanta City Councilwoman, and founder of the Thompson Foundation for Family Justice. But before I was any of those things, I was a little girl who watched her mother die not from medical complications alone, but from the calculated cruelty of men who valued property over human life. The truth of that morning, the real truth that shaped everything that followed, wouldn't fully reveal itself until 75 years later, when a letter arrived that shattered my understanding of my own story and forced me to confront a choice between justice and peace that no one should ever have to make. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where all the best and worst stories begin, with love that was stolen too soon. Mama was everything beautiful in my small world. Rose Mary Williams had skin like warm honey and a voice that could make gospel songs sound like lullabies when she sang me to sleep. She worked as a seamstress from our tiny apartment, her Singer sewing machine humming through the night as she created beautiful dresses for Atlanta's colored middle-class teachers and ministers' wives who could afford her skilled hands. Daddy was different then, too. Joseph Williams stood 6 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to carry the world, or so it seemed to my 6-year-old eyes. He worked for the Atlanta and West Point Railroad, a job that paid decent wages and filled him with pride in honest work. Evenings would find him teaching me to read from Mama's Bible, his deep voice making Bible stories come alive, while Mama's needle danced through fabric nearby. We weren't rich, but we were rich in the things that mattered. Love flowed between us like music, binding our small family together against the harsh realities of 1940s Atlanta. Until February 15th, 1948, when everything shattered like glass hitting concrete. The bleeding started before dawn. I woke to find Mama doubled over in our kitchen, her hands pressed against her swollen belly as dark stains spread across her nightgown. The baby, my little brother, who would never draw breath, was coming too early, too wrong, too violently for her weakened body to survive. "Get Daddy!" she cried as another wave of agony tore through her. "Get him now!" I ran barefoot through our apartment, shaking Daddy awake with hands that trembled like autumn leaves. He took one look at Mama, and his face went white as winter. "Stay with her, Rose," he commanded, already pulling on his pants. "I'm going for help." What happened next, I learned only in fragments over the years, pieces of a puzzle that wouldn't form a complete picture until that letter arrived decades later. Daddy ran first to Dr. Morrison's house, 6 blocks away, the only colored doctor in our part of Atlanta. But Dr. Morrison was delivering another baby across town, his wife explained, through a cracked door she barely opened for a desperate colored man at dawn. So Daddy ran to the white section of town to Dr. Harrison, who lived in a grand house behind iron gates. He pounded on that door until his knuckles bled, begging for help, offering everything we had and more. "Please, sir," he pleaded with the man who answered not the doctor, but his grown son, Harold Harrison. "My wife is dying. The baby's coming wrong and she needs a doctor. I'll pay whatever you ask. I'll work for nothing. I'll get off this property before I call the police." Harold Harrison snarled, his face twisted with the particular hatred reserved for colored folks who dared approach white homes. "My father doesn't treat your kind. Never has, never will." "She's dying," Daddy whispered, tears streaming down his face. Please, she's dying. Harold Harrison's response would haunt my father for the rest of his life. Good. One less of you to worry about. By the time Daddy returned home empty-handed, Mama was gone. She died holding my hand. Her last words, a whispered prayer for the daughter she was leaving behind, in a world that had just proven it would rather watch her die than extend basic human decency. I didn't learn about Harold Harrison's refusal until I was much older. All I knew that morning was that Mama was dead, Daddy was broken, and something fundamental had shifted in our universe. The gentle giant who had carried me on his shoulders became a stranger who smelled of whiskey and rage. She's gone because I couldn't save her, he would mutter during those first terrible weeks, bottle in hand, eyes fixed on nothing. Couldn't get help when she needed it? What kind of man can't save his own wife? The drinking started immediately. Within days, empty bottles appeared under our kitchen sink like glass monuments to grief. Within weeks, Daddy was coming home from his railroad runs with violence in his eyes and whiskey on his breath. The first time he raised his hand to me, I was trying to cook beans and cornbread the way Mama had taught me, standing on a chair to reach the stove, making noise when a man needs quiet. He slurred his palm, connecting with my cheek hard enough to knock me off the chair. I hit the wall with a sickening thud, stars exploding behind my eyes. When my vision cleared, I saw him standing over me with an expression I'd never seen before, part rage, part disgust, part something that looked almost like hatred. You got her stubborn ways, he muttered. Maybe a firm hand will beat some sense into you before you end up just as dead. From that moment, my childhood became a daily navigation of his moods and fists. I learned to recognize the signs, the tightening of his jaw when the bottle was half empty, the particular silence that preceded explosions, the heavy footsteps that meant I should disappear until the storm passed. The neighbors knew, of course. How could they not? Mrs. Patterson from downstairs would find excuses to send me on errands when Daddy's shouting grew too loud. Mr. Jefferson, who swept our building's front steps, would slip me pieces of hard candy and ask about the bruises on my arms with eyes that held too much understanding. But in 1948, Atlanta, in a community where survival meant minding your own business, and the law saw colored children as barely worth protecting, intervention was a luxury no one could afford. Family business stayed family business no matter how much blood it spilled. School became my sanctuary when I could attend. Miss Dorothy Henderson at Carver Elementary noticed what adults chose to ignore the careful way I moved on. Some mornings the long sleeves in warm weather, the way I flinched when anyone raised their voice. She began keeping me after school to help organize the library, giving me safe space and books that transported me beyond our apartment's suffocating walls. Your mother must have been a remarkable woman, Miss Henderson observed one afternoon as we shelved arithmetic books. You handle these like they're treasures, not just objects. Mama said reading was the one thing nobody could steal. I whispered, surprised by tears that burned my eyes. No matter how poor we were, Miss Henderson began sending books home wrapped in brown paper packages I hid under loose floorboards when Daddy was drinking. By lamplight, with his snores rattling through thin walls, I devoured stories of people who overcame impossible circumstances, who transformed pain into purpose, who proved that survival wasn't the only option. Sometimes you could actually thrive. The worst beating came on a July evening in 1951. I was 9, lost in Harriet Tubman's story, when Daddy came home early and found me reading instead of cooking his dinner. What the hell is this? He ripped the book from my hands, pages scattering like wounded birds. Think you're better than your dead mama? Think book's gonna save you? The belt came off with practiced efficiency. But this time, something inside me refused to cower. Mama said I was supposed to be strong. I screamed through the pain. She said I was supposed to be better than this. His face went white with fury. Your mama's dead because she thought she was better dead, because... He stopped suddenly, as if realizing he was about to reveal something he'd kept hidden for 3 years. Because what? I demanded, my child's voice cracking with desperate courage. Because the world don't want us to be better. He finished quietly, but I heard the lie in his voice. There was more to Mama's death, something he couldn't bring himself to say. Something that was eating him alive from the inside. High school brought new possibilities when Miss Henderson secured my admission to Booker T. Washington High in 1956. There, I met Marcus Thompson, a gentle boy whose professor father had taught him that intelligence was a gift to be shared rather than hidden. Marcus treated me with a respect that felt revolutionary after years of Daddy's cruelty. More importantly, I met the civil rights movement. The first meeting I attended was at Friendship Baptist Church in 1958, where Dr. King spoke about the fierce urgency of now. His words lit something inside me that had been smoldering since Mama's death, not just anger at personal injustice, but understanding that our family's tragedy was part of a larger pattern of systematic cruelty that demanded organized resistance. When volunteers were called for nonviolent resistance training, I stood without hesitation. Marcus rose beside me, his hand finding mine as we joined the movement that would reshape both our individual futures and the South itself. The sit-ins came first, 25 of us taking seats at Rich's department store lunch counter, facing hatred with dignity, while police dragged us away with unnecessary violence. The jail cells were overcrowded and hostile, but they couldn't break the spirit we'd built through shared purpose and freedom songs that echoed off concrete walls. My arrest photograph, looking directly at the camera with unshakable dignity, appeared in newspapers across the country. Suddenly, I was the girl with grace under pressure, invited to speak at rallies where I connected my personal story to our collective struggle for human dignity. Marcus proposed on the Lincoln Memorial steps during the 1963 March on Washington after I'd addressed the youth rally with words about transformation and community. "Will you build a future with me?" he asked, the Washington Monument rising behind us like a promise. Not just a marriage, but a partnership in the work we're called to do. We married that winter at Friendship Baptist, Dr. King himself offering the blessing. Our children came in the late 1960s, Dorothy in 1967, Michael in 1969, born into a world still violently resistant to change, but filled with parents determined to create something better. By 1972, I was elected to Atlanta City Council, becoming the first African-American woman to hold that position. The campaign was brutal, anonymous threats, racist flyers, hostile audiences that questioned my right to exist in political spaces. But I persevered, driven by memories of Mama's death and determination that other families wouldn't suffer what ours had endured. My first major initiative was comprehensive child protection legislation that addressed not just immediate safety, but the systemic conditions that made families vulnerable to crisis. It was personal work fueled by understanding that prevention required treating root causes rather than just symptoms. But my greatest failure came in 1975, when my most ambitious project, the Family Preservation Act, was defeated by a coalition of conservative council members and business interests who saw it as government overreach. The bill would have provided wraparound services for at-risk families, addressing poverty, mental health, and substance abuse before children needed removal from homes. I watched 18 months of careful coalition building crumble in a single vote, 6-5 against. That night, I went home and cried for the first time since childhood, not just for the defeat, but for all the children who would suffer because adult politics had triumphed over human need. "Mama," 12-year-old Michael said, finding me at our kitchen table with tear-stained cheeks and crumpled legislative papers. "Why are you sad?" I looked at my son, this beautiful boy who had never known the fear that shaped my childhood, and saw an opportunity to teach rather than simply mourn. "Because sometimes the right thing loses," I said honestly. "But losing doesn't mean stopping. It just means finding another way." That defeat led directly to my decision to establish a private foundation after leaving office, a way to accomplish through direct service what government bureaucracy couldn't achieve. The Thompson Foundation for Family Justice became my life's work, helping thousands of families strengthen themselves before crisis struck. But the deepest complications came from my own children, as they entered adulthood with different perspectives on social change than the generation that had fought in the streets. Dorothy, now a civil rights attorney, believed in working within existing systems to expand justice gradually. Michael, a community organizer, grew increasingly frustrated with what he saw as his family's accommodationist approach to persistent inequality. The argument that changed everything happened in 1995 when Michael was 26 and running voter registration drives in Atlanta's most neglected neighborhoods. "You've spent your whole career making the system more comfortable for people like us," he said during a heated family dinner discussion about strategy and tactics. "But the system is still crushing people who look like us, still denying basic dignity to families that can't afford lawyers and foundation grants. And you think burning everything down will help those families? How exactly?" Dorothy shot back, her lawyer's precision cutting through emotional rhetoric. "Destroying institutions doesn't automatically create better ones." I listened to my children debate approaches to justice, hearing echoes of arguments that had raged throughout the movement's history. Finally, I set down my fork and spoke with the authority that comes from decades of both success and failure. "You're both right," I said quietly, and the table fell silent. "Dorothy, the system can be changed from within, but only when there's pressure from outside forcing it to change. Michael, revolution without construction just creates chaos that hurts the people we're trying to help most." I paused, thinking of Mama's death and all the injustices that had followed. "But there's something else you both need to understand. Sometimes the most radical act isn't dramatic confrontation or patient negotiation. Sometimes it's simply refusing to let truth stay buried." I had no idea how prophetic those words would prove to be. The years passed with the rhythm of meaningful work foundation programs that helped thousands of families' grandchildren who carried our values into a new century, recognition for contributions that felt both significant and incomplete. Marcus and I celebrated 60 years of marriage surrounded by chosen family whose lives had intertwined with ours through decades of shared commitment. But everything changed on a cold January morning in 2025 when a letter arrived that shattered my understanding of my own story and forced me to confront truths I'd never imagined. The envelope bore careful handwriting, "Mrs. Catherine Rose Williams Thompson," with a return address showing only David Williams, Atlanta, GA. I nearly discarded it as another fundraising appeal, but something about the formal way my full name was written made me open it instead. "Dear Mrs. Thompson, I hope you'll forgive this intrusion from a stranger, but I believe we may be family. My grandfather was Joseph Williams, who worked for the Atlanta and West Point Railroad in the 1940s and 1950s. According to family stories, he had a daughter named Catherine who disappeared from his life when she was still young. I've spent years wondering what happened to my Aunt Catherine carrying her name even though we never met. When I read about your background in newspaper articles about the Foundation's work, I began to suspect you might be her. If I'm right, I have something that belongs to you. Something my grandfather left behind that explains everything about why he became the man who drove you away. I'm enclosing photocopies of documents I found after my grandmother's death last month. If you are my Aunt Catherine, these will be painful to read, but they contain truths that have been buried too long. Please contact me if you're willing to learn what really happened the night your mother died. With respect and hope, David Williams." My hands shook as I opened the accompanying envelope, revealing photocopied pages in handwriting I recognized despite decades of separation. Daddy's careful script, the penmanship of a man who had valued precision even as his life fell apart. The first document was dated February 16, 1948, one day after Mama died. "Today, I failed as a man, as a husband, as a human being. Rosemary is dead because Harold Harrison valued his hatred more than her life. I begged him for help, offered him everything I had and everything I could ever earn. He laughed at me, called my dying wife one less nigger to worry about, slammed the door in my face while she bled to death 6 blocks away. I should have broken down that door. Should have forced him at gunpoint to help her. Should have been man enough to save my wife instead of begging for scraps of human decency from a monster who sees us as animals. Instead, I let her die. Let Catherine grow up motherless because I was too weak, too scared, too beaten down by this goddamn world to take what my family needed when it mattered most. Harold Harrison killed my wife as surely as if he'd put a gun to her head. And I'm going to spend every day for the rest of my life making sure he pays for what he did. The second document was dated 3 months later. Went to Harrison's house again today. This time with information I've been gathering about his business dealings. Found out he's been cheating colored clients out of property for years using legal tricks and forged documents. Could expose him, destroy his reputation, maybe even get him arrested. But Catherine was there when I came home reading one of her books, looking so much like Rosemary. It stopped my heart. Started thinking about what happens if I go after Harrison directly. He's got money connections power. If I challenge him and lose, what happens to Catherine? Decided I can't risk her safety for my revenge. But I also can't look at her without seeing Rosemary, without remembering that I failed to save the most important person in my world. God forgive me, but sometimes I wish Catherine looked less like her mother. Maybe then I could love her without hating myself. The third document made my blood run cold. Catherine's getting too smart, asking too many questions about why Rosemary really died. Caught her listening at the door when I was talking to myself about Harrison. She's starting to figure out there's more to the story than I've told her. The drinking helps me forget sometimes, but it also makes me mean. Took my belt to her again last night for no reason, except she looked at me with Rosemary's eyes, and I couldn't stand the accusation I saw there. I'm becoming the monster Harrison already was. Destroying the only good thing Rosemary left behind because I don't have the courage to destroy the man who actually killed her. Maybe it's better this way. Maybe Catherine needs to hate me enough to run to get far enough away that Harrison can't hurt her if I finally do what I should have done 3 years ago. There were dozens more entries spanning nearly 2 decades, a systematic plan for revenge that evolved into detailed surveillance evidence gathering and ultimately a decision that shattered my understanding of everything that had shaped my life. The final entry was dated December 1965. Catherine's gone. Married name Thompson now saw the announcement in the colored paper. She's made something beautiful of her life despite everything I did to break her. She's exactly what Rosemary dreamed she could be. Tomorrow, I'm going to Harold Harrison's house one last time. Not to beg, not to threaten, to deliver justice that's been delayed 17 years too long. If anyone reads this after I'm gone, know that everything I did wrong, I did from love. Everything I did right, I did too late. But some debts can only be paid in blood, and some truths can only be told when the people who love us are safe from the consequences. Catherine Rose. If you ever learn about this, know that your mama died a hero, and your daddy died trying to be one. The monster between those two moments isn't who I really was. It's who this world made me when it stole everything that made me human. I sat in my study for hours, reading and rereading those pages until the words blurred together through tears I couldn't stop. Daddy hadn't been just a broken man taking out his grief on an innocent child. He'd been a man driven slowly insane by carrying the knowledge of who had really killed his wife, torn between desire for justice and fear for his daughter's safety. Marcus found me there when he returned from his afternoon walk, the documents scattered across my desk, like evidence from a crime scene that had never been properly investigated. "Oui, Rose." His voice carried the gentle concern that had sustained our marriage through 6 decades of shared challenges. "What is it?" I handed him David's letter and watched his expression shift from confusion to horror as he absorbed what our grandson was telling us about the grandfather I'd never been able to forgive. "My God," Marcus whispered. "Rose, if this is true, it changes everything and nothing," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. Daddy was still the man who beat me, still the father who made my childhood a nightmare. But he was also a man carrying an impossible burden torn between love and justice in ways that destroyed him. "What are you going to do?" Marcus asked, and I heard decades of partnership in that question, not judgment about what I should do, but absolute support for whatever I decided. I looked out our window at Atlanta's skyline, thinking about Harold Harrison, and whether he was still alive, still unpunished for the cruelty that had set everything in motion. Thinking about justice delayed and truth buried, and whether an 83-year-old woman had any obligation to resurrect ghosts that everyone else had forgotten. "I'm going to call David," I said finally. "And then I'm going to decide whether some truths are more important than the peace they would destroy." The phone call that followed changed everything I thought I knew about my family's story, and forced me to confront choices I'd never imagined having to make. David Williams turned out to be a thoughtful man in his 40s, a social worker whose own career had been shaped by family stories about the aunt who disappeared and the grandfather whose rage had consumed him. We met 3 days later at my house, along with his wife Sarah and their teenage children, my great-niece and great-nephew carrying family DNA I'd thought was lost forever. "Tell me about December 1965, I said without preamble once we'd settled in my living room. "Tell me what really happened to my father." David's expression grew pained as he pulled out another folder of documents, police reports, newspaper clippings, court records I'd never seen. "He went to Harrison's house on December 23rd. David began slowly. "According to witnesses, he rang the doorbell like he was making a social call. When Harold Harrison answered, Granddaddy shot him 3 times in the chest, then sat down on the front steps to wait for the police. I felt the air leave my lungs in a rush. He killed him! The trial lasted 1 day," David continued. Granddaddy pled guilty, refused to let his lawyer present any defense. The judge sentenced him to life in prison, where he died of a heart attack in 1971. "He never tried to contact you, never explained what he'd done or why he'd done it." Sarah leaned forward, her voice gentle but insistent. "But there's more, Aunt Catherine. Harold Harrison wasn't just the man who let your mother die. David's research found evidence that he was systematically defrauding colored families out of their property, forcing them into homelessness and poverty. Your father's action may have saved dozens of other families from losing everything they had." I absorbed this information slowly, feeling the careful narrative of my life rearranging itself around facts I'd never known existed. Daddy hadn't just been a broken man who'd beaten his daughter. He'd been a man who'd chosen justice over family, who'd sacrificed his freedom and his life to stop a predator who was destroying other families the way he'd destroyed ours. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked David. "Why dig up all this pain after so many years?" David exchanged glances with his wife before pulling out one final document, a handwritten will, dated the day before Daddy shot Harold Harrison. "Because he left you something?" David said quietly. "Something he wanted you to have when you were old enough to understand what he'd done and why he'd had to do it." The will was simple, leaving Daddy's few possessions to David's father, with one exception, a safety deposit box that could only be opened by his daughter Catherine Rose Williams, regardless of what name she might be using when she reached her 80th birthday, or learned the truth about Harold Harrison's death, whichever came first. "We opened it last month," David explained. "After Grandma died and we found all these documents, we figured you had a right to know." He handed me a small wooden box worn smooth by decades of handling. Inside, I found Mama's wedding ring, which I'd thought was lost forever, and a letter in Daddy's careful handwriting. "My dearest Catherine Rose, if you're reading this, it means you've learned the truth about Harold Harrison and what I had to do to stop him from hurting more families the way he hurt ours. It also means you've lived long enough to understand that sometimes good people have to do terrible things to protect innocent people from monsters. I know I failed you in every way a father can fail a daughter. I know my drinking and my anger and my fists made your childhood a hell you didn't deserve. I know you probably hate me and you have every right to, but I want you to know that every blow I struck was aimed at myself, not you. Every cruel word came from my own self-hatred, not anything lacking in the beautiful child your mother left behind. You were perfect, Catherine Rose. You were everything good about Rosemary and nothing bad about me. I became a monster because I couldn't live with letting a monster go unpunished. I hurt you because I was too broken to love you the way you deserved to be loved. But I never stopped loving you, never stopped being proud of the strong, smart, beautiful woman I knew you would become despite everything I did to damage you. The ring was your mother's engagement ring, the one I sold to pay for her funeral? I bought it back from the pawn shop the day before I went to Harrison's house because I wanted you to have something of hers that wasn't stained by my failures. Wear it and remember that love is stronger than hatred, that justice is worth any sacrifice, and that sometimes the people who hurt us most are fighting battles we can't see. I'm sorry I couldn't be the father you needed. But I'm not sorry I made sure Harold Harrison could never hurt another family the way he hurt ours. Love always, Daddy. I held that letter for a long time, feeling decades of carefully constructed anger crumble into something more complex and painful. Grief for the father I'd never really known, pride in his courage, horror at the choice he'd felt forced to make, and overwhelming sadness for all the years we'd lost to misunderstanding and necessary secrets. There's something else, David said quietly. Something we need to decide together as a family. He pulled out a manila envelope marked Evidence, Harrison Property Fraud, 1948-1965. Granddaddy spent 17 years documenting Harold Harrison's crimes. Names, dates, forged documents, testimony from victims who were too scared to speak up while Harrison was alive. Enough evidence to prove that dozens of colored families were systematically robbed of their homes and life savings. Sarah leaned forward, her expression intense. Some of those families are still alive, Aunt Catherine. Their children and grandchildren are still dealing with the poverty that resulted from those thefts. There are legal remedies available now that weren't available then, ways to recover stolen property to get compensation for damages that destroyed generations of wealth building. I understood what they were asking. The evidence Daddy had died to obtain could still bring justice to families who'd been waiting 75 years for someone to acknowledge what had been done to them. But pursuing that justice would mean exposing everything Daddy's crime. Mama's death, the chain of violence and retribution that had shaped my entire life. What do you think I should do? I asked David, genuinely uncertain about the right choice. I think you should do what Granddaddy couldn't, he replied without hesitation. Fight for justice without destroying yourself in the process. Use the foundation, use your reputation, use the legal system to get these families what they're owed. Let his evidence save people instead of just punishing the man who hurt them. That night, I sat in my study with Marcus, looking through decades of documentation that revealed the scope of Harold Harrison's crimes and the methodical way my father had built a case against him while slowly destroying himself with guilt and rage. He could have used this evidence to get Harrison arrested. Marcus observed, studying forged property deeds and victim testimonies. Could have sent him to prison without committing murder. Why didn't he? I thought about that question for a long time before answering. Because he didn't trust the system to deliver justice to a white man who'd harmed colored families. Because he'd already begged for help and been refused. Because sometimes people reach a point where they stop believing in anything except their own ability to stop monsters from hurting more innocent people. Now? Marcus asked. Do you believe the system can deliver justice now? I looked at the evidence spread across our table, proof of crimes that had destroyed families, condemned children to poverty, stolen dreams, and opportunities from people whose only crime was being vulnerable to a predator with power and connections. I believe we have to try, I said finally. I believe that's what Daddy would want for his evidence to save people, instead of just destroying the man who hurt them. The next morning, I called the most prominent civil rights law firm in Atlanta and scheduled a meeting to discuss a case that had been waiting 75 years for someone brave enough to bring it to court. The legal battle that followed consumed 2 years and made national headlines as the Harrison property fraud case became a landmark victory for restorative justice and recognition of historical crimes against African American communities. Using Daddy's meticulously gathered evidence, we were able to secure settlements totaling $43 million for 37 families whose property had been stolen through fraudulent schemes. More importantly, the case established legal precedents that made it easier for other communities to seek compensation for similar historical injustices, redlining contract buying, forced displacement, and dozens of other methods that had been used to systematically steal wealth from families who were already struggling against impossible odds. But the victory came with personal costs I hadn't anticipated. The media attention brought scrutiny to my father's actions that forced me to publicly acknowledge that the founder of a foundation dedicated to nonviolent solutions to family crisis was the daughter of a man who had committed murder, even if that murder had been motivated by a desire for justice rather than personal revenge. How do you reconcile your commitment to nonviolence with your father's decision to kill Harold Harrison? A reporter asked during a particularly aggressive press conference. I thought carefully before answering, aware that my words would be quoted and analyzed by people looking for inconsistency or hypocrisy in my life's work. But I don't reconcile them, I said finally. I hold both truths simultaneously, that violence is wrong, even when it's motivated by love, and that sometimes good people are driven to terrible choices by systems that refuse to deliver justice through legitimate means. My father's action was both wrong and understandable, both criminal and heroic. The tragedy isn't that he killed Harold Harrison. The tragedy is that he felt like he had no other choice. The case concluded in December 2024, almost exactly 59 years after Daddy had sat on Harold Harrison's front steps, waiting to be arrested for murder. The final settlement hearing was held in the same courthouse where Daddy had been sentenced to life in prison. And I couldn't help thinking about the symmetry as I watched families receive compensation for losses they'd carried for generations. Afterward, as reporters and lawyers and family members celebrated in the courthouse lobby, I slipped away to visit Daddy's grave for the first time since his burial in 1971. The headstone was simple. Joseph Williams, 1915 to 1971, beloved father and husband. David had added those last words when he'd become old enough to understand that love and failure could coexist in the same heart. I placed Mama's ring on the granite surface and spoke to the man I'd spent my entire life trying to understand. I know now, Daddy, I whispered. I know why you couldn't save her that night, and I know why you couldn't live with letting her killer go unpunished. I know you loved me even when your pain made it impossible to show that love in ways I could recognize. The wind stirred the bare branches overhead, and for a moment I could almost hear his voice, not the slurred, angry voice of my childhood memories, but the gentle voice that had read me Bible stories and taught me that words had power to transform the world. We got them, Daddy, I continued. All those families you documented, all those crimes you spent 17 years investigating, we used your evidence to get justice. Not the kind of justice that destroys the seeker, but the kind that heals communities and prevents future harm. Standing in that cemetery, surrounded by the graves of people who had lived and died in the struggle for dignity and justice, I finally understood what Mama had meant when she told me to be strong. Not strong enough to endure cruelty without breaking, but strong enough to transform cruelty into compassion. Strong enough to use pain as fuel for healing others instead of perpetuating cycles of harm. That evening, I returned home to find my children and grandchildren gathered for what had become an impromptu family celebration. Dorothy and Michael had put aside their philosophical differences to work together on legal briefs for the Harrison case. Their children, my grandchildren, had spent their winter break from college researching family histories and locating descendants of Harrison's victims. Tell us again about great-grandmother Rosemary, my granddaughter Ashley said as we sat around the dinner table sharing stories and memories. Tell us what she was like before all the bad things happened. I looked around the table at faces that carried traces of Mama's features and Daddy's determined chin, at young people who would inherit a world that was still far from perfect, but infinitely more just than the one that had killed my mother and broken my father. She was everything beautiful. I said, my voice steady with the peace that comes from finally understanding your own story. She was love made visible, hope given voice. And the most important thing about her wasn't how she died, but how she lived with courage, with dignity, with absolute faith that love could triumph over hatred if enough people were willing to fight for it. Michael raised his glass in a toast. To Rosemary Williams, who planted seeds of justice that are still growing. To Joseph Williams, Dorothy added, who watered those seeds with his own blood. And then to Catherine Rose Williams Thompson, David said, who harvested the crop and shared it with everyone who was hungry for justice. As we clinked glasses around that table, I felt Mama's presence more strongly than I had since the morning she died in my 6-year-old arms. Not as a ghost haunting my memories, but as a living force that had shaped everything good I'd managed to accomplish, despite the circumstances that had tried to break me. The Foundation continues its work, now expanded to include legal advocacy for families seeking compensation for historical injustices. Dorothy runs the legal clinic, Michael leads the community organizing efforts, and David has joined our board as family historian, ensuring that the stories of people like Daddy and Harold Harrison are preserved as cautionary tales about what happens when systems fail to protect the vulnerable. As for me, I spend my days writing letters to the families whose lives were changed by our legal victory, attending speaking engagements where I tell the complicated truth about justice and violence and the sometimes impossible choices people face when systems fail them. But mostly, I spend time with my great-grandchildren, teaching them the lessons Mama taught me about strength and dignity, sharing the stories that help them understand how they came to inherit freedom that previous generations had to fight and die to secure. What's the most important thing you want us to remember? My great-grandson Marcus, named for his great-grandfather, asked me last week as we sat in my garden watching sunset paint Atlanta's skyline in shades of golden rose. I thought about that question for a long time, considering everything I'd learned about love and loss, justice and forgiveness, the ways that individual choices ripple through generations to shape the world we leave behind. Remember that every person carries invisible wounds, I said finally. Remember that the people who hurt us are often fighting battles we can't see. Remember that justice delayed isn't always justice denied. Sometimes it's justice waiting for the right moment, the right person, the right combination of courage and wisdom to bring truth into the light. I paused, thinking of Daddy's letter and Mama's ring, and the long journey from childhood terror to adult understanding that had brought me to this moment of peace. But most importantly, I continued, remember that love is always stronger than hatred, even when hatred seems to be winning. Remember that every act of cruelty can be answered with an act of compassion. Every injustice can be met with organized resistance. Every lie can be defeated by people brave enough to tell the truth. Young Marcus nodded solemnly, his 8-year-old face serious with the weight of family history and future responsibility. I'll remember Great-Grandma Rose, he promised. I'll remember all of it. As darkness settled over our garden and the first stars appeared in the winter sky, I whispered a prayer of gratitude for the journey that had brought me from that terrorized child to this moment of hard-won wisdom and unexpected peace. We did it, Mama, I said to the glittering darkness above us. Your songbird learned to fly, learned to fight, learned to forgive. And the song continues through voices you never heard but helped to create. The story isn't finished. It never is for any of us. But this chapter has reached its natural conclusion, with truth finally told and justice finally served, with a family reunited across decades of separation and misunderstanding, with love proving once again to be stronger than the forces that tried to destroy it. I am 83 years old, and I am finally completely free.